Okay, and welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Titansgrave Diggers. I'm Chris Hussey here with my co-hosts Eric and Shannon. Say hello, folks.
Hi.
Hello.
And of course, today, actually, the show itself, Titansgrave: The Ashes of Valkana, has debuted. Episodes 0 and Episode 1 both came out today, and we're kind of going to, basically over the course of the show here, we're going to talk about the episodes themselves, the content of them, their relevance to gamers, their relevance to, gamers of, I guess, all skill levels, really, whether it's veterans like ourselves or new people just getting into the hobby. And in addition to the content up there, because this is, being an actual play, the show has a certain storyline to it. There's characters to get invested in with the show, and there's a lot to be entertained by. And so there's stuff worth talking about there as well. So let's go ahead and we'll get started with. Let's just start with the first episode, which in this case would be episode 0. And Eric, why don't you go ahead and just kind of give a brief rundown of what the episode was about?
Well, episode 0 was primarily a almost like an RPG 101. Very basic. This is what the world is. This is what the basic rules are. A brief history of the world itself, and character introductions mostly. A lot of gamers call that session 0, where you're sitting with the game master and you're making your characters. You're coming up with subplots, or you're coming up with character motivations and things like that. And that's exactly what Wheaton did here. Was he sat down and had a session 0 with his players, so that way everybody was on the same page. It was quite obvious that everybody had very likely sat down with him individually and made their characters from scratch, and then this was their introduction to the group. I think it worked out really well because in a lot of times, and anybody who's played role-playing games for any length of time knows that character introductions sometimes kind of get in the way of the story that you're going to actually play. So to set aside some time to do that is very productive, because you're able to kind of give each person a little bit of feel for the world, especially with this, because it's a completely created world by Wheaton rather than some established game world. So he had to set down like ground rules of basic play, but he also had to kind of set their characters in the world that they live in, and he had a very small amount of time to do that. Obviously on mic, or obviously on camera and mic or whatever. So, but yeah, and so you got a little bit of backstories, you got some character connections, you got the character secrets. All of these things are things that I think every game master should probably do, because.
Go ahead, Shannon.
I think it definitely seemed like they did sit down together as a group prior to that to figure out the sort of character connections like they had already, or else they were doing an excellent job of yes-anding, which is also possible because they're all slightly acting inclined people. But I think. Like Eric was saying, it's definitely a good idea to all get together and talk about like how your group is cohesive and how everyone knows each other. I think that's definitely an important part of any role-playing game.
Yeah, one of the things, is just to kind of continue with that. I mean, looking at it from my perspective, they did definitely did a very good job with the introductions and with their in showcasing their character backgrounds and giving you things about them to at least either identify with or decide, yeah, I might like that, or I might like what this this particular character certainly has to offer. But I really did, when Eric, you mentioned the secrets aspect of it, and having done some something similar in games that I've run in the past. I really enjoyed the fact that that was that was a prominent part of that episode, in the sense of where all of a sudden you create this situation where there's a lot of there's now more investment, basically, is kind of what was happening. There's you learn that there's these little things which, to veteran gamers, you realize those are probably going to come up later on at some point during the game,
Right.
which is great. And so now you want to try and find out what those things are. You want to stay with them and watch and see how these things develop. And for new players, I think that it also has an appeal in the sense that there's little potential plot twists along the way, because everything was kind of very standard up to a certain point. Good, but kind of standard. But then this was just a nice aspect to see how it's going to play out, down the road.
I absolutely love the secrets aspect. I know in one of the games I had the most fun playing, Eric was actually the one who ran it, and we ride back and forth to our game night together. And one of the most funs I ever had was we did most of our gaming in that 45 minutes going to game, because my character had a huge secret, and I didn't want to play that stuff out at the table. I would wait and get in the car, and I'd be like, okay, so this is what I did during this break, and this is what I want to do, sort of thing. And it's something extra that you get to feel like you're really contributing to the story. I think it's a good way to bring players in. Not only are they more invested because they either want to develop the secret more, or they want to involve it, but they also get to affect the story.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that in a way it kind of reminded me of Fate, because, and that's, obviously they're using the Fantasy Age system, but that kind of a connection, it's indicative of a lot of your newer, less rules intense story games where you're developing character interactions and connections and things like that, rather than focusing on stats and things like that. It's story based thinking, plot based or subplot based, and that's, I think that something like that, just knowing, knowing the actors that were, the players and things like that, that's things that actors understand. What is my character's motivation? What is this? What is that? And that allowed them to kind of get into a kind of familiar zone. Okay, I'm talking with the director, and I'm coming up with maybe this. It may never come out, but it's something that I need to know, so that way I can effectively play this character correctly. And I think Wheaton did a good job of doing that. He, it may have been a little bit staged, having him pulled aside and doing that, or maybe not. I mean, it's one of those things that anybody who's gamed for any length of time, you've done it. You've pulled the game master aside and said, I totally want to steal his magic dagger or something like that. So it's kind of a nice little slice of this is what happens with role-playing games, and that's what Session Zero was supposed to be. It was supposed to show people who don't know how to play or have never played or haven't played in a long time, this is what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, even if it was, staged when they did the secrets thing, there's they definitely were engaging in a lot of, that was a television, mentality going into that. They're doing that for the viewer's benefit, but you're absolutely right. You still, even if you do have around the table, if you do have secrets, you go off into that separate room, and I think that was a nice way to showcase that kind of thing. You talked a little bit about the age, or the Fantasy Age rule system. Being unfamiliar with those rules, I was actually very interested to learn a little bit about how mechanically this was going to, things in the game were going to go down. And one of the things I liked about it when he was explaining some of the basic rules as far as task resolution goes was the when you roll doubles on your dice roll, and how if it allowed you to perform, certain types of stunts, certain types of extra things, special moves and maneuvers and things that you can do, which is cool in the game, and absolutely makes for a lot of fun, gives a chance for the player to kind of describe something neat. But the one thing I really liked was the aspect of if you roll 3 6s, And that not only is it a stunt that you get to do, but then it becomes the stunt that has an impact on the world as a whole and becomes this legendary thing. And we saw just a very minor example of how that would work in the first episode, but that appealed to me a lot, both on a player and a game master level, I think, because it's one way in which, as a player, you can feel that you have a true impact on this world that you're interacting with, and that not only can you become, play in it, but that at the same time you can actually truly change the course of certain things or have a long-standing impact on what happens in that world.
As I watched the episode 0, I had actually written that down. I'm like, I really like this crit mechanic. I like that. It's not just, you do maximum damage, it's you do something legendary. I really like that. And then, so once I watched episode 1, or chapter 1, I was even more excited because it actually came up. And I liked how Will Wheaton had not just like, all right, so that was legendary, people will be talking about it for ages. He gave a specific example, and it was beneficial to the bar. It's like he told your tale, and it dissuaded this guy from he was gonna scam him, and it dissuaded him. I really liked how that ended up working out.
Yeah, that particular instance, and I know we're kind of skipping ahead, but when you're talking about role-playing games, there's nothing more exciting for a table than rolling something that like in a D20 based game, rolling a natural 20. A player rolls that maximum with a bonus effect or whatever, and it really excites the player. And excitement and things like that can completely be infectious for the table. And when that mechanic itself, the doubles mechanic, some people know that Fantasy Age is actually derived from the Green Ronin Dragon Age game. That was kind of like the predecessor to this, and that was a mechanic that was in that. It's very elegant in its simplicity, and it's so everybody knows what a six-sided dice is. So a lot of people say that that game itself was perfect for new gamers because there's not the barrier for entry is very low, and it's easy to understand. And you throw in an element like what Wheaton did with you roll triple sixes, and you make it's completely legendary. When you roll 3d6 and you get an 18, it should be legendary. There's no doubt about it. So I think that little bitty thing, it may have been just kind of a throwaway thing that he said, this is what we'll do if this happens. He could have done 10 episodes and it never happened.
Right.
But it did, and it's something that he took something as completely mundane as what that character did, and just because you rolled an 18, he turned it into something completely, spectacular.
And especially we've all had that moment where you're playing a game and you're rolling for something that isn't as important to the story, and that's the roll you crit on. And I like that that's kind of where that was going, but then it's like, oh no, it's legendary.
Right.
Yeah. And here's why it's legendary. And then he goes on to explain, in good detail as to, here's what happens. Here's how, long-lasting what you just did is in this world. And I think that when that happens again, say whether it's in a critical, combat-related encounter or in some sort of big social showdown later on, I think that it will be even there'll be even more excitement generated, amongst the players for the success that'll have, and it certainly as a story element creates very good memories for both the players and in this case too the viewers.
Right, and that's one of the things that I think is so brilliant about that one house rule is it gives you the opportunity to reflect and look back at something that you did and say, I really did affect the world that I'm playing in, and you can go back and go, remember that time that I did that one thing? You can refer to these things, and I always say whenever you're playing a game, very few times do you remember your rolls. You may remember one or two, or hey, the one time I did some damage to that one monster.
That very important crit though.
Right.
We had a player in a game I played who had been turned to stone by a basilisk, and so whenever he rolled, I think you have to make 3 saves. He rolled that 3rd save, and it was important that he got it. Like when you make that roll, it's like that's one of the few rolls you remember. You don't remember, last week what you rolled to hit the monster.
Right.
Let's go ahead and move on to episode 1 here, seeing as how we're kind of talking about stuff that happened in there. On the whole, I'd have to say that the setup and just the general presentation of it was pretty solid. Will, as a GM, did a very good job of giving them that background prep, the general box text that sometimes a lot of GMs will default to at the start of an adventure, saying, your group has done this, and he kind of laid that out, gave them a very good reason to be together. They've got this mysterious item, and then gave them motivation to go to this other place to maybe find out more about this, and then the adventure kind of unfolded. Out from that point, I was amused by the very obvious relationship to Will's love of beer.
Right.
That was kind of amusing. But for as funny as it was, and for all of the things around there that he put, it was a very simple task and thing that as new players, which you get the impression that they're all kind of new players to this, they're very, very easy for them to latch onto and to take and do something with.
Right. I think like I said before, having the session 0 eliminated a lot of that how did we meet stuff that could get in the way. And the story he's presenting, like you said, is very traditional, role-playing game. You have your task. Go and complete your task. Here is something that you need to carry with you that you may not really understand, but it's the thing that that's going to probably be a plot device that's going to travel all through this whole thing. But the thing I liked about it was, this is a pretty big deal. This show itself is a pretty big deal because this is kind of Wheaton's baby, and it's very, very easy to go a little bit too big. And he stayed very simple, and that's very important because you also have to understand that he's producing this for mass consumption, and not everybody's a hardcore gamer and doesn't need the next Lord of the Rings. This is something that's he's starting very small, and he's building up towards it. Sure, it's got the faceless evil lurking in the shadows that's coming back to power and all that stuff. I mean, these are old tropes that people who play role-playing games, video games, you understand this. But that in itself is part of the charm because you understand it, so you don't have to worry too much about, trying to figure out the plot at this point. It's very early in. He's putting all the focus on the players and the characters, so that way he can kind of showcase them.
I really think it's really set up to bring new players into the fold. I think it's good that they went with the Fantasy Age system. I guess that's Adventure Gaming Engine system, so that's kind of weird. They went with that game because it is... I've read a little bit of Dragon Age, and it's very much so written to bring in new players, whereas some of your more hardcore games aren't. And that one is, and in the show you can definitely tell that he's trying to bring in new players. It starts out with a sort of ode to RPGs, and then he even, not only in session 0 but also at the beginning of session 1, he goes into like what an RPG is and stuff like that, and just like kind of reiterates it and doesn't want to leave anybody behind. So if you didn't watch session 0, this is what it is. This is what we're doing. We want you to do that. And I think it lowers that barrier to entry. It makes it easier to bring people into the fold, because now, instead of being like, oh, here's this giant book you have to read and then you can play, you can play an RPG.
I'm sorry.
Actually, let's talk about that for a second, because that's a very good point about making it very palatable for more mass consumption. We talked a little bit about this before we got on the mics, just about the general aesthetic nature of the setup of it. One of the things that was very obvious to me was they weren't doing this around a table.
Right.
They're not 5, 6 people sitting around a table, and there's not a screen in front of one of them, and there's not. I mean, they had their character sheets, but they were kind of there on the coffee table. And that's the whole thing, is that Will is sitting in this interview chair, and everyone else is on the guest couch, basically. And that's the whole. I mean, everything else seemed very appropriate to the type of situation. Either you're playing in your living room or you're playing in your basement. But as far as how they were positioned, that's what it was. It was just them just kind of sitting around and using mechanics to, tell this particular story for this night's activities. There wasn't even any miniatures. There was no battle mat. There was none of those things, and so it's just very. It was very casual and very non-threatening, I guess, in a certain way.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. I liked that there wasn't a battle mat and there wasn't minis, and it's not like, if you're someone who wants to start playing this sort of game and you watch that, you're not going to be like, oh God, I need all that stuff. Because they didn't have anything. They had 3d6 and pieces of paper, and that's it. And I thought that was very good. I also liked how, which we haven't really talked about the art at all. I liked all of the art, but I liked how whenever they had that final battle, they put up the grid, and they had the positions of everybody. So, yeah, the players had to do it all theater of the mind, but the viewer doesn't. It's like, oh, so that's where they're positioned, and that's how many people are how many bad guys are left and stuff like that.
Right. It was. I thought, talking about how they were positioned and things like that. The first thing that struck me when I started watching them and how they were positioned, it struck me as funny, as it is almost like a mirror opposite of how Big Bang Theory does. How they sit when they play role-playing games. It's almost a complete opposite, where one person sits on the right and they all sit on the couch. Wheaton sat on the left and everybody sat on the couch. I don't know if that was intentional or not. Probably just a coincidence, but it, like you said, it was very, very casual. People who maybe aren't comfortable with gaming or don't really know what gaming's about can watch that and go, oh, well, that's not nearly as intimidating, or just as weird as, like you said, Chris, with having a table and have all you see is somebody's eyes over a screen, and kind of like Home Improvement, and you don't know what this person's all about. You're rolling secretively behind the screen. Now, Will rolled behind a screen, but a lot of his stuff was disseminated what he was doing. He didn't do a whole lot of secretive stuff. But when you're talking about how he presented it and how he played the game, one thing I noticed right away was he used the theory of yes, in that, and it's completely foreign to some of us graybeards when it comes to role-playing games, where the game master habitually says, yes, you can do that. Do you want to? Yes, I want to do this. Okay, do it. And that, I think, is something that increases the player's input. If you're putting the player down and saying you can't do this, they're going to stop trying. And Wheaton did that very well, where he, even some bizarre, maybe even asinine things.
The dance moves, for example. I mean, that just seemed in a normal circumstance, utterly ridiculous. But it was essentially the very first thing that a player said they wanted to do. I want to go and I want to make a check. I want to go on the dance floor and make a check for awesome.
Right.
Well, as a GM, you almost can't say, well, no, you can't. You let them have it. They have that initial win, and suddenly they buy in to what's going
Right.
on, and now they all want to try and do that. And you're absolutely right.
The first place where I really noticed it was Limley. I have all the characters written down here, so I was referencing that. Limley sat down at the bar, and she's just describing her surroundings too. She's like, "All right," and there's this guy next to me, and it's like, "Oh, that's like, because at least in like games I've played in, like I'm sure the GM wouldn't mind if I said, "Oh yeah, there's this person here," but it's so I'm so used to the all right, is there anyone next to me versus being like, no, there is someone next to me, and this is who it is, and
Right.
we're
And I think-
burping at each other.
And I
Right.
think that shows a lot of there's a lot of trust on both ends. They certainly trust their game master that whatever I throw at him, he's going to roll with it in some way or another, and probably in a good way. And at the same time, he's trusting them because he knows of their ability to do things and make things interesting, which helps because they were actors, of course. So he kind of
Right.
has this familiarity with them, and is certainly is aware of their abilities. That he's going to trust that they're going to give him things to work with. Um, I do have to say, Shannon, you mentioned the the nod to old role playing. This was very much a new spin on you meet in a bar. I mean, the action took place in the tavern,
Right.
which of course everybody says don't ever do that ever again. But of
Right.
course this is exactly what happened, and it was fun.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think when you're talking about trust and players feeling comfortable, and that's the main thing. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that these are actors and they're used to performing. But it's kind of it can be intimidating for a player. And don't get me wrong, each one of those people, the game master, through all the players, are very talented people because it's not easy to do what they just did. And and to have that kind of trust and a self-confidence to say, I'm going to sit at the bar, this guy's sitting next to me, this is happening. To be able to have the self-confidence to, number one, say that, and to expect everybody else to kind of buy into it. It kind of shows how creative, because they're comfortable with their creativity. And that's a very important thing. It makes me wonder if, I'm sure Whedon probably said, you don't ask me what's happening. I'll tell you when stuff happens. You tell me what's happening around you.
I thought it kind of seemed like perhaps like it kind of seemed like these character or these people were new, like kind of new to it, and they weren't used to like playing characters like this. There were just a few things that kind of struck me. I'm sorry, what's that, Chris?
I said they had no script.
Right, and I don't think that they were necessarily RPG role-playing gamers. These abbreviations, man. I don't think that they necessarily were like seasoned veterans by any means, but I think it definitely works for this.
Let's switch gears a little bit. Let's just talk about what actually occurred in the game session itself. I mean, it was essentially two kind of structured things. It was the initial setup, or three structured things. There was the initial setup, then you had the essentially what amounted to the role playing encounter in the bar, where they kind of did their initial things. And then there was essentially the combat encounter, the requisite initial session combat encounter to get everybody familiar with how the rules work and the powers and the abilities that their characters have. From like a strict story flow standpoint, how do you guys think that played out? Was there enough story going on in there? Did you see any elements of maybe some groundwork being laid for future plot things? Or was this just more of your standard, let's get used to everything kind of session, and we'll worry about the deeper plot elements, in the subsequent chapters?
I think that what he did with the whole bar thing, it's kind of an old game master trick or weapon, if you will, where you want the players to roll dice early, and you want them to feel comfortable making decisions and understanding kind of how the mechanics work before you get into combat, because combat can be a little bit more intense. So going in there and letting the one character dance and do something kind of silly, another one picks a pocket, that kind of thing gets the dice rolling early, and that was very important, because then when you move on to the combat, everybody's kind of used to looking, and something that's I think is overlooked is understanding where things are on your character sheet, and doing that early kind of gets people looking at their character sheet to understand the layout, where the bonuses are, what I can do, and that kind of thing. So that in itself, I think, was a very smart thing for him to do, was to kind of set that up.
Shannon?
Sorry, you just tweeted at me, and so I saw it.
Sorry, yeah, I did. We're actually, because we're still discussing it, and I wanted to make sure in case because we already.
Right.
Hello, we have 2 people watching us actually right now, which is amazing.
Wow,
so that's fantastic. I know, right? This inaugural episode, no followers right now in G+ besides ourselves, and here we are. We already have 2 people watching, so that's fantastic. If I could somehow get the Q&A function to work on here, it's disabled for some reason, I would activate it. But hey, there you go.
That's what episode 2's for.
Yeah, exactly. To iron out a lot of these bugs. But go ahead, Shannon. Were you gonna say something just about how story-wise things went out?
Yeah, I like how I definitely liked how he encouraged role playing early on, which is probably easier for this set of people. But I know for a lot of people, like whenever I first started gaming, like, it was intimidating. That was way more intimidating than battle, and he definitely encouraged that. I really liked how he kind of brought in. I kind of thought of it how the Chaos War tales that
Yeah.
they're yearly tales that happen, right? I kind of thought of it as a fantasy age, an RPG version of the Aristocrats. The Aristocrats. Sorry.
Oh, the Aristocrats.
Yeah, so it's like there's this joke that everybody knows and everybody tells, but everybody tells it differently, and they do it in their own way. And so I kind of thought, oh, this is the player's version. They get to do that, and I thought that was kind of interesting how he did that.
That was I thought that was in a certain way it was kind of gutsy, because you're sticking these players, and yep, they have the acting ability, but you're sticking them in this still unfamiliar world, and you're giving them the framework of how he was doing that was still so loose. I thought it was very gutsy to put them in that kind of situation. They responded very well, and the whole story about the putting out the fires in the glass forest with this crystal and so on, and then how everybody jumped in and got into it was very good. But it was, I think that took, there was a certain level of guts there, and I thought to myself as I was listening, I thought, would I do that to new players? Would I have the wherewithal to think about doing that? And how might they respond? It could have been a very different thing. It definitely had the potential to fall flat if they would have just kind of kept waiting for him. And I think the good lesson to be learned there, from both a player and a GM standpoint, is to, take that chance and give those make those opportunities available to your players, and do what you need to enhance them. But get them to basically run in, jump in and then kind of run the show, which is exactly what the players were doing at that point in the encounter.
I think it definitely comes down to knowing your players. I've been lucky enough to initiate 2 different. Well, the first time I got to initiate one person to role-playing games, and it was their first ever role-playing game, and then the second time I got to run for an entire group who had never played before. And it was really different seeing the 2 The first time it was with 3 seasoned veterans and this new person, and like she was very hesitant to role play at all, and like whenever we were doing the skills checks and like rolling dice, she was definitely more comfortable. But then the second time I did it, when I had the whole group of noobs, I was surprised because I had expected it to be like me mostly running and me mostly talking, and then they were like they just ran with some stuff, and I'm like, and they did like night 1 they were already role playing. I'm like, oh my god, I never expected this. Like I expected to kind of have to explain things a little more, and they just got it. And so it was really cool that they kind of got to experience the better, not necessarily the better of the two, but definitely, hey, this is what this is all about. It's role-playing games. It's in the name.
Right. Yeah, I'm talking about the whole tale telling and things like that. It allowed them to improv, and I'm sure they're all very familiar with things like that, so that's why they seemed very comfortable with it. I watched it, and I thought to myself, there's no way in the world that I would be able to do that with like the people that I run for, because they would have actually set the bar on fire, and then they would have like looted everybody, or tried to hurt everybody, and like pick their pockets as they left and things like that, or try and take over the bar, that kind of thing. That's old role playing game mentality, especially when you're talking about like power gamers and things like that that I'm certainly one of. That's what's running through my mind. Was I'm glad he didn't ask me to do this, because I would have completely have done something probably very stereotypical gamer. They took it as, let's do some acting and some role playing. So
yeah, and that was good. But you're right. You're right. I think I think that's part of the. I think there's some benefit in there to them being relatively new players, is that they don't think in that particular way. They don't have that mentality of, oh, well, if there's a problem in the town, if we just get rid of the entire town, there won't be any problem. It's not, they actually are thinking in the context of, oh, this is a social situation, and we're going to behave in a socially appropriate manner, and not be murder hobos and
right.
doing those kinds of things. Speaking of murdering, let's move ahead and just discuss the combat encounter briefly. As we all know, combat can certainly drag, and I think the encounter was a good basic thing to kind of, like I said, get everybody invested in what their characters can do, what their abilities are, how to interact and work together in combat, how they can get hurt, and of course, when you're doing an Eric, you certainly are very familiar with this. When you're doing an actual play, that is a part that can just drag everything down to a screeching halt. And
Right.
the pacing of it with the sound effects and Shannon, you mentioned, going to the grid and showing the interaction for the illustrations that were there. And there were definitely a lot of, edits being made to move things along. I think that helped make it a much more palatable, experience, both for newbies and veterans alike.
Right. I like the graphics that they used to kind of break down, roll, bonus, total, how many, other, the points from the action dice or whatever they call it, the, how many stunt dice, how many points from the stunt dice, which is, I love that mechanic, by the way. The higher you roll on your stunt dice, the more points you get, to do cooler stuff. And I think that, like the one shot an armored foe and got doubles and a high number on their stunt dice and found a chink in the armor, obviously bypassed the armor and things like that. That in the way that initiative works in that game, the way that combat in general works in that game, it's fast and it sounds really fun. And everybody at the table can just really get into it. You don't have to do a whole bunch of math. And the way that they did it with the little pop-up numbers and things, it wasn't distracting. And if anything, I think it helped teach the game as it's happening. So,
Absolutely. All right, Shannon, any other thoughts on that?
Not necessarily on the combat. I was something Eric had said. I really liked how they did the NPCs. So not only was Will Wheaton doing the voice, like the voices, which is something that I've gotten really used to. Anytime Eric or other DMs run a game, there's usually a lot of silly voices for the NPCs. So I definitely like that. But I also like that they had, like they would do a full shot of drawings in the scene, and then they continue to have the NPC that was talking in the corner every time. I like that. It definitely helps the viewer, and I think it'll definitely come in handy later in episodes. It's like, oh yeah, it's that guy.
Right.
Versus, just having the voice to go off of and a name.
Yeah, and I think that was actually one thing they did neat in the sense where when they had that one person speaking about the tale telling thing, and they got into when on our end as viewers we were hearing this bit of an echo kind of going on, and that was really more for our benefit, so we could kind of stay invested in what was happening. But obviously around their table or on their couch and chair setup, they're not hearing that. And for them as players, they got to experience what it's actually like to be around the table like that. But from an entertainment standpoint, it worked really well, I think, for us, and kept the interest on our end. And so that shows definite thought process going into the production quality, and I appreciated that.
Right. Yeah. The production quality, just in general, from beginning to end, I think was top notch. I think that going forward, if we're going forward to the next episode or all the way through the season, I hope that they don't go away from any of that stuff. Keep teaching the game. I think that people are going to get involved at different points. Most likely we'll start at the beginning and go all the way through the end. But especially with this whole production getting to the point where when the final episode airs, I think it's within the next week, a major convention's going to happen, and they're going to debut a lot of the source material and the game and things like that at this convention. I think that if you watch this show and they keep teaching the game and keep teaching little nuances within the game, I think that's going to be a major seller at this convention and forward, because people are going to I want to play this game. I want to play this game with my friends because I could teach them this game, or even experienced gamers can say, this looks like a really fun, fast, entertaining game to play.
Yeah, I was going to say it's definitely good, like we had kind of said before, for those new players who haven't ever played before, watching it being played and also going through and having those little details of this is how this rule works and this is how that rule works, definitely opens those gates so that it's a little easier for new gamers to come on.
Right.
I agree. All right. Well, unless you folks have anything else you feel is necessary, I think we've covered about as much ground as we're going to be able to cover for these 2 episodes. So, thanks again for the fact that we had 2 people or 3 people coming in and watching us. I know, right? That's amazing. So it's like we doubled the size of our hosting here.
Wow.
The plan is we'll be back either on Tuesday after each episode airs, or perhaps that Thursday. But you can follow us on our Google Plus page, and we'll believe we'll also be getting a a Twitter account as well. But we'll have all the information there as it develops. So thanks again for everyone who did tune in to watch, and for those of you who will watch later on. And Eric and Shannon, thank you very much, of course, for being here as well.
Thank you.
We'll see you all next week, and I guess maybe, I don't know, we'll see you in the Ashes, I suppose. I don't know. What should we say for an end thing? Will we see you in Valkana? Will we see you in the grave? I'm not.
Listen, Chris, we just need to be classy. Deuces. Out.
That'll work too. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.